Here we'll highlight sockets, ratchets, torque wrenches, and torque sticks.
One of the major features of sockets that you want to look for is 12-point versus 6-point. And typically we're going to choose a 6-point socket because it holds not only each corner of the fastener but also each flat space or face on the fastener. So this will give you a nice secure fit so that you can apply more torque or more pressure to a fastener to either loosen or tighten it without rounding off the bolt head or the fastener head. So with a 12-point socket, the issue is that you're really only holding the fastener at the corners. So when you apply a lot of pressure or torque to it, it has a tendency to strip off or remove the metal from the corners, especially on a smaller bolt like this one, and you end up with more of a round shape than a hexagon. And that's definitely a big issue because once it becomes round, it is no longer feasible to use a socket. Then you're trying to use pliers and all types of other things to remove or extract that fastener. So as you can see, as we look a little bit closer at this bolt, a 12-point fastener has been used with quite a bit of pressure here, and it's been removing a lot of the material on the corners of this, the head of this fastener. So the top of it, if you look straight down, it ends up giving more of a round appearance than a hexagon, and therefore we get the term rounded off. The bolt or the nut has been rounded off, and so that's why we want to use a 6-point socket whenever possible. With sockets, there's a lot of options, and you've probably heard a technician ask their apprentice, could you please hand me the 12mm shallow socket or the 12mm deep or semi-deep well? All that really refers to is the length or height of the socket. So a shallow socket is obviously shallow or very low and small. So this is ideal if you have a flat bolt head and you can just simply put the socket right on top. Now, we don't always have that, so sometimes we have a nut that has been screwed onto the stud and we need a deep well socket in order to slip over top of the stud, attach to the bolt or the nut, and then take the nut off. There are also special instances where the deep well socket is too long to fit in a tight space. So then you end up using a semi-deep well socket, and that will still go over a stud depending on how long the stud is, and it will still be able to access the nut and get that off. Okay. Now, some other situations that may arise which will cause you to use some other tools are going to be swivels. So swivels are really helpful because you can attach, let's say, one socket onto the swivel, and then it can pivot, and you can get into some very tight areas as I'm about to show you. Now, this is a chrome swivel socket, so if you wanted to use an air tool, okay, or even an electric impact, then you really want to use an impact socket, or in this case, an impact swivel. So they have chrome versions of everything, which is really for hand tools, and then there's the darker colored, the black, which is usually for impact sockets, swivels, and extensions as well. So you always want to make sure to use an impact swivel. These impact swivels also have a nice little spring in them to absorb a lot of the shock. So that also helps to prevent the swivel from breaking off and then you have to go and get a new tool. Usually through a good company, you can get the tools, any kind of hand tool, warranted for life. Okay, so also swivels come attached to sockets, and these are particularly helpful if you are working in a very tight area and you don't have enough space to use a regular swivel with a socket on top. So having dedicated swivel sockets, all in each different size, so this is a 15, but they come usually in a pack of anywhere from, for this 3/8 inch drive, from somewhere around 8 or 10 millimeter, all the way up to 19, sometimes even 21 millimeter if you want to get a specialty socket. Okay. This is a standard impact socket. This is a 1/2 inch drive. So this is something you would use on the end of your large impact gun that you would normally use to take off wheels. So again, keep in mind that you always want to use impact sockets with power tools, because these sockets are actually softer than the chrome, so they can handle that immense pressure and that immense torque, and also the repetitive pulses that the impact tools, especially impact guns, actually produce. So it's constantly being hammered, and if you don't have an impact socket and you're using a chrome socket with your impact tools, then what's going to happen is this cannot absorb all of that impact, all that force. So it's going to end up cracking, and it can shatter and end up in your eye and those kinds of things, which is really, really not preferable. Now we can go ahead and take a look at our extensions, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's always good to get away from your work just a little bit. You don't want to always hover on top of each and every little bolt and nut that you're trying to remove or install. So it's nice to use some nice long extensions so that you're not bending over all day. Also, just simply to access fasteners that you wouldn't normally be able to access without these extensions. So extensions actually come pretty long. If you wanted to get some, you can get some extensions that are 2 and 3 feet long, and you will have some in your toolbox, especially for those bell housing bolts. But when you first start out, you'll usually have a 6-inch extension like this, a 3-inch extension, and maybe like a 1-inch extension. Now these are all different drive sizes. So this is a 3/8 inch drive. This is also a 3/8 inch drive, but this is a 6, this is a 3-inch, and this is also an impact extension, and this is not. So again, you want to make sure you're using impact tools with your impact guns. Okay. Now, this is obviously very small. This is just a 1/4 inch drive, 1-inch extension. So those two go together. And those actually do come in very long 6-inch extensions as well. Now, sometimes you will come into a situation where you don't have one extension that is exactly the right length. So what you can do is you can simply just attach the two extensions together, and you end up with a slightly longer extension than you did before. Although this is completely acceptable, you want to bear in mind that when you do this, the longer the extension is, the less torque you're actually applying to the fastener, because that torque gets used up in the shaft here. Okay? And also every connection that you make is also going to use up some of that torque. So you want to try not to do this too often. Another nice extension that you can use, and this is obviously a 1/2-inch extension, is a wobble extension. So basically the drive here is tapered so that when you put an extension on top, or a socket on top, it wobbles. Okay, so it's very similar to a swivel, but it doesn't quite move as much. but the good side to this is that it also does not use up as much torque as the swivel extensions do, and it's less likely to break as well. So there's all different kinds of sockets and extensions and ratchets that you can purchase for yourself to make your job a whole lot easier. But you definitely want to start out with just the basics, the most used tools first. And if you find that on a regular basis you need to use wobble sockets or whatever the case may be, then go ahead and purchase those specialty items. Another specialty socket that you'll probably see is an oxygen sensor socket. And you'll notice that it has this nice cut in the side of it, and that is to allow for room for the oxygen sensor wire. So this will be able to slip on over the wire and onto the oxygen sensor itself. Now these are known to be very difficult to get out at times, so I'm going to be using my nice long 1/2-inch drive ratchet slash breaker bar. It's really just a ratchet, but it has a very long handle which gives me a lot of leverage, so that makes it very easy for me to remove any oxygen sensor that I want. One very commonly used specialty socket is a spark plug socket, and if you're able to see in the center there is a rubber grommet that holds around the end of the spark plug. So I will show that. So since the spark plug on this vehicle is down in the spark plug tube, I'll be using an extension. Just drops right down in there. Use my ratchet. Make sure it's set to off. We don't want to tighten instead of loosen. Loosen it by hand. Spark plugs should not be installed too tight. Should is the operative word there. Okay, and that rubber grommet was able to grab onto the insulation of the spark plug and pull it out. Now, just FYI, in case you run across this and your socket that you're using is maybe not a spark plug socket, or the rubber has is missing from the actual socket, then what you can do is you can use the coil or spark plug boot, depending on what type of system it is. Push it down into the spark plug tube and voila, that'll take your spark plug out instead of trying to fish it out with pliers and all sorts of other devices. For this particular engine, we need to torque the cylinder head bolts to 29 foot-pounds. So we spin the handle till we get to the 25 mark. So that right there is 25 foot-pounds, or technically pounds-feet. And then we're going to turn it 1, 2, 3, 4, up to number 4, and that'll give us 29 foot-pounds. You can see that this little notch is between the 25 foot-pounds mark and just right before the 30 foot-pounds mark. Okay, so here's the cylinder head torque to yield bolt. So Mr. Daniel Alex is going to drop that in the cylinder head. Start tightening it down with the appropriate socket, and then attach the torque wrench to the socket and rotate the torque wrench until he hears a nice, loud, audible click, and he will stop turning as soon as he hears it click. We can also use a beam style torque wrench for this same application. Alright, so now that we have torqued our head bolt to 29 foot-pounds, we also need to rotate it a full 90 degrees. So what we're going to use in order to ensure that we rotate our head bolt 90 degrees and not 100 degrees or 80 degrees is a torque angle meter. So we simply attach it onto our socket that we're going to use to tighten the head bolt and set the needle indicator to 0, tighten the screw down, lock it in place, and then we'll use a breaker bar or even a nice long-handled ratchet, something with a lot of torque that you can apply, and rotate it until the needle moves to 90 degrees.
Now you don't always have to use a torque wrench for every torque application. Here we're going to be using a torque stick, which is rated at 100 foot-pounds and 19 millimeters. So these lug nuts are actually 21 millimeters. That's why I'm going to be using a torque extension that I can attach a 21 millimeter socket on the end of too. And then I can proceed to tighten my lug nuts in a star pattern. Now you want to make sure that you always tighten the lug nuts by hand first, at least 2 to 3 turns, to prevent any cross-threading that might occur while you're using your impact.